This morning, you have in your worship bulletins a little bio and history about Ed and Joanne Childress, and I hope you take time to read that and to celebrate the ways that Ed and Joanne have been active in the leadership of this congregation as elders. I'm going to share with you a little history about elders. What is an elder? What is this thing we call elder? And when did elders first appear in the leadership of the community of God's faithful? Ed and Joanne Childress are among those who for more than 5,000 years have faithfully answered a divine call on their lives to serve. The first biblical reference to elders dates back to the time of Israel's exodus from Egypt. In the wilderness story, found in the 18th chapter of Exodus, Moses was exhausted and depleted and weary of advising the Hebrew slaves and mediating their daily disputes. Now, don't think that ever happens to pastors these days, but it did to Moses because Moses wasn't quite as strong-willed as we are, I think. Moses had a father-in-law named Jethro, and Jethro came to Moses and advised his son-in-law to select key people from the community called elders to give and guard and guide and lead the people on their journey toward Canaan. We learn about elders from three key passages from the Old Testament. And you'll see those: Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we learn from those passages that Israel selected elders to be judges or leaders. Judge was more like a leader, not a judge like we think who sits on a judge's bench in a law court, but a leader, presider over the community. And they acted as kind of this corporate complaint department. Because when you journey through the wilderness, there's a lot of complaining. Not that there's going to be any complaining on the tour this October, okay? Closer to the time of Jesus and the early church, about 150 years before the early church, there is an interesting sect of Jewish people called the Essenes. You may have heard of that group. A faction of the Essene community settled at a site called Qumran by the Dead Sea. It was a community of messianists, or people who expected the arrival of the end time, that God's kingdom would be ushered in very soon. And they prepared for that, and they lived together. They had a scriptorium where they copied texts of the Bible. This community produced many of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in 1947 by a Bedouin shepherd boy. Qumran was destroyed by the Roman army in 68 AD, just 2 years before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. But during that stretch of time, from the first Jewish revolt in 64 AD, you would have priests from the temple who were not so happy with how the temple was working. And some of these priests came down to the community at Qumran and lived for a time. Most scholars believe that Jesus did not have any direct connection with the Qumran community, but the Jesus community shows in many ways how similar it was to the community of Qumran. For example, the early church and the Qumran community shared in communal meals. They pooled their possessions. Everything shared what they had in common for the good of the community, kind of like today's kibbutz that are in Israel and other places. Both were apocalyptic Jewish movements that anticipated the imminent arrival of the end time. There are differences, and because of these differences, we don't believe that the early church had direct involvement with Qumran, but possibly it did. That's a little background to some organization at Qumran that I want to tell you. Each village or little encampment at Qumran was under the supervision of a person they called a Mabacker. Mabacker was a word that means guardian or overseer. And this figure was very similar to the bishop or the elder. Same thing in the early church. From the Damascus rule of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find a description of the Mabacker, or the guardian of the camp. In the Dead Sea Scroll it says, "He shall instruct the congregation in the works of God. He shall cause them to consider God's mighty deeds, and shall recount all the happenings of eternity to them. He shall love them as a father loves his children, and shall carry them in all their distress like a shepherd his sheep. He shall loosen all the restraints which bind them, that in his congregation there may be none who are oppressed or burdened." It's a wonderful description, isn't it? A wonderful description of what we have come to call elder. The roles that the Mabacker fills are teaching. He instructs the congregation in the works of God. Pastoral care. He loves them like a father. Justice ministries. He works to loosen the bonds that bind them. And community organization. He shall examine every man and find a place for him, and financial counseling on matters of buying and selling. All of these are contained in the Damascus document, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Fast forward about a century to the early church. Prior to the church, we know Jesus gathered with him a small community of disciples. And from this little flock, Jesus selected 12 apostles. It's the title of the sermon series we're in. Next week we'll look at Bartholomew, which is most likely Nathaniel in the Gospel of John. Jesus gave the 12 the Lord's Prayer, he gave them the Lord's Supper, and the rite of baptism. And on the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem, 50 days after Passover, the church was birthed into being. And through the remaining years of the first century, the movement spread very rapidly throughout the Roman Empire. As it spread into these communities, the church needed organization. And so Christians recognized that in the community there were individuals who had certain talents and abilities that were suited to special ministries. The office of elder was held by one whom the community held in highest esteem. Elders were teachers of the congregation, of the ways of Christ. They helped their people discover the Christian gospel and what that meant in their normal lives and routines. This was something that was new in the world at the time. Christianity had never been heard of, and people were watching this new religion. How the people shared what they had in common, how they organized their life, how they loved people, how they went across normal tribal boundaries and accepted those in their community, how they cared for the women and the orphans and children. Councils of elders were elected to give spiritual and moral guidance. They presided in worship, and they served as guardians of the faith in cultures that had to compete with other cults and religions of the day. Today we honor you and Joanne with the title of Elder Emeritus. And this distinction is being given to you by the elders and members of the congregation because of all of these things that I just mentioned through the history of elders and even before elders in the church. You and Joanne have carried the title of elder with highest respect. A summary of your work shows how you and Joanne have been involved in the teaching and the counseling and the worship life and the justice ministries of this congregation. Diane Mickey is going to present you in a little bit about your lives to the congregation in just a moment. To serve God with such passion and energy and commitment is a high calling that requires nothing less but a very, very close relationship with God. And you and Joanne have been exemplary teachers and students, taking every opportunity to instruct others in the faith and also to grow in your own wisdom and knowledge. You and Joanne were one of the first that opened your doors to Chris and I when we came. Your hospitality, inviting us over to your home and sharing a bit about the history of Bethany Christian Church and the Bethany community was good orientation for us. You have been such wonderful support for every pastor of this congregation during your time here. From Reverend Howard Holverson, who married you, up into every minister that followed. Eldering is a lifestyle. It's a way of being and doing. And yes, we may take a break because the bylaws say we have to take a break after we serve our 2 terms of elders. You and Joanne were always called back after that 1 year's break. And we always called you together. You and Joanne have manifested the life of service and witness of the gospel of Jesus Christ that gives evidence of God's grace and mercy and love. And there are many new people among us who don't have that history with you, who don't have, who are new and learning the names and faces of people in the congregation. So I'm glad to introduce you and Joanne to those. I want to end by letting you know I chose the passage from Ephesians because I think this passage speaks of reaching the point where we might be filled with the fullness of God. And when we look at you and when we looked at Joanne and her leadership in the congregation, your lives give testimony of being filled with the fullness of God and helping to transform the church and lives one soul at a time. God bless you for your ministry here